Welcome to this session on Next Stage Public Services. A real pleasure to have you with us this evening. I'm joined by a number of people who are part of a group with myself called Next Stage Radcials. We work for all sorts of different organisations in all sorts of different roles. Next Stage Radcials is not a commercial thing. It's basically just a place to have fun, to connect. And in the words I usually describe it by, for cool people that are doing cool things, just to get together and share their learning. So that's what we want to do with you tonight. I'm not professing to be cool, but the people I'm going to introduce you to are, and they're the ones doing the cool stuff. So I'm going to shut up and introduce them. So as you look in the participants box, you'll see anyone that's from the Next Stage Radcials with their name led by the word fishbowl. Not because they've got weird names, but I just thought that'd make it easier for them to spot. So I'm going to come first of all, if you don't mind, to Fishbowl Annie Francis. Do you want to just say hello?
Hello, everybody. Yes, so my name is Annie, and my job, I suppose, is I'm a midwife, although I'm not working clinically at the moment. I'm doing all sorts of interesting things, including supporting midwives in the NHS to set up a continuity of care team.
Thanks, Annie. I'll go to Fishbowl Mark Smith next, please.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, I'm Mark Smith from Gateshead Council. I'm the Director of Public Service Reform. Really, we're just trying to rethink and redesign how public services work for people that need them. And we're not taking anything as read. We're very interested in bespoke by default, as opposed to snapping to established rules and regulations which aren't working. So that's more on that later.
Thanks, Mark. Saskia, would you mind saying hi?
Hi everyone, I'm Saskia Dorman. I'm a consultant in palliative care at a hospice in Dorset, Forest Home Hospice, and yeah, I'm involved in some work we've called results through relationships in Dorset, particularly around end of life, but looking a bit more broadly than that as well.
Thanks, Saskia. Andy Crosby.
Hi everyone, I'm Andy. I run the Collective Impact Agency, which is a CIC based in northeast of England. We work as system stewards in the region with a particular focus on Gateshead. We do all kinds of weird and wonderful things within that, but with a particular focus helping systems learn through creating new learning spaces.
Thanks, Andy. Jeremy.
Hi all, Jeremy Cox. I'm a partner with Andy at Easy Rink. We're a small consultancy that helps people create better ways of working and better places to work, public and private sector, UK and abroad. Again, as with Mark, more of that later.
Brilliant. And I'm just trying to spot, have I missed anyone there on my fishbowl list, or was that as well? Yes, I knew I'd missed someone. Sorry, Anna, I couldn't find you in the list. Anna.
That's all right. Hi everyone, I'm Anna. I work as Systems Thinking Lead at Camden Council in London. I help people within my organisation to think and do things differently, reshape their services using different principles, and giving leaders different roles so that they can help rather than hinder what's going on at the front line. So in reality, I feel like a combination of an agony aunt, coach, doer and enabler, depending on what day it is.
Thanks, Agony and Anna. Brilliant. So these are our cool people that are doing cool things, and our assumption is that you are also cool people doing cool things. So we're not here to profess that we are the experts in Next Stage Public Services, but I particularly asked this group to be part of a fishbowl this evening because I know that they're doing really good stuff, really interesting stuff. I know that they will give a warts and all account of what they've been doing and help us to learn some of the hard lessons from their experiences. So we're going to structure this session into two roughly even parts in terms of time. There'll be a fishbowl where I'm going to invite the people that have just introduced themselves to have a discussion about what they've learned as they've tried to create new ways of working in public service. And then we're going to go into breakout rooms and invite you to reflect on what's resonated about that. Where do you see different things? What else do you see? And also, before we finish up this evening, we'd like to invite you to create some action statements. So these can be as ambitious or as sort of straightforward as you like. but we'd like you to just think about at the end of the session, what can you leave here and do that would start to kind of provide the footsteps towards a different way of doing public service? Okay, so for now though, I'm going to ask our fishbowl participants to ready themselves for a discussion. If I could ask anyone else to go on mute for the moment, if you're not already on mute, and we'll ask our fishbowl participants to come off mute if you're on mute currently, and we're going to get started. So my question to kick us off, folks, is, and I'm going to direct this to Mark Smith, if you don't mind, Mark, is I know you're doing a lot of work around Next Stage Public Service up there in Gateshead. You're Director of Public Service Reform. You've been doing this work for years in Gateshead, but also before that in a number of other places. So could you just give us a flavour of what's your vision for Next Stage Public Services, and why might that be considered a radical vision?
Thanks, Andy. It's hard to know where to start with it, but I'll start with the notion of rethinking how we what we do. One of the things that we've noticed is that whenever we are asked, or whenever we find that we want to try to improve something, one of the things we immediately encounter is this notion of eligibility. It all comes from a scarcity mindset, which is not unreasonable given the resource bundling. But what we tend to find is that we come to understand when we dig something up that the premise is broadly the same, whether it's in a social care setting or a health setting or a policing setting, which is how much of what we do can we do to people? How much of what we do can we disperse, and who is it that we have to turn away? So it becomes a sense of eligibility, and that is all stemming from this idea that we design against. So we try to manage demand, but the truth is we can't manage demand. We're kidding ourselves. We just manage what we decide to do. And of course, what we learn is what everybody knows is that you're just saying to a lot of people, "Well, come back when you're worse," and they do, and then we end up wondering why we struggle. So rather than take a scarcity mindset, which is, again, has a logic to it, we only have so many resources, there's a lot of need and demand out there, we need to draw the line somewhere. We'll draw it here, we'll engineer a way of determining whether something coming in meets that threshold or not. We'll do the things that do and we won't do the things that don't. And no matter how much you work on that plumbing, it doesn't work, because essentially you're looking at eligibility and you're not looking at context. And if you want to understand and solve a problem with people rather than do things to them, context is really important. So we've gone away from assessment and eligibility, and we're moving towards understanding and sizing the job. So if there's an amount of need or things to do out there, and we have insufficient resources to do it as a council, rather than try to manage demand, we try to build capacity, which is where we talk to partners, not on an equal footing, as we try to equalise the relationship rather than become a power broker, because that doesn't work either, it just annoys people. So we'd rather say, okay, if in working with communities we see a problem this big and we've got this amount to do, how can we turn the capacity into that too? And how can we work with people on strengths rather than simply create an assessment approach which deals in eligibility? So we've only got really two rules, which is don't break the law, don't do any harm, and everything else is on the table. And we've applied this to things like debt. So council tax debt, we don't send bailiffs around now, we simply talk to people about why they're in debt, and typically 90% of the time we don't work on issues to do with debt. And what happens is the collection rates stay the same or get better, because we're trying to help people in the context of their debt, and the debt's normally towards the bottom of the pecking order of things that matter. So we don't ask, are you eligible? We ask what matters, what does a good life for you look like, how might we help you with that, who can help you with that? And we take a totally different approach. We've done it with homelessness. Again, context is key, and we're doing it in different localities to try and understand community assets as well and work with partners. There's a lot of headwinds. People have got to where they've got to in management positions because they've dealt with eligibility really well. They've been able to navigate a system which is predicated on a scarcity mindset. So when we come along and say that's unsustainable, and ultimately you're just saying come back when you're worse, we have to learn how to say that delicately and in a context that helps people to learn rather than to show them up. So instead of eligibility, we talk about bespoke by default. So the default reaction to a collection of organisations, including but by no means restricted to councils, is if you need something more than a transaction, booking a squash court, we know that doesn't need much context, but anything that needs context, it's likely the response you need is bespoke. It might be relatively straightforward and bespoke. It may be deeply complicated or complex and bespoke. But bespoke is the key. And what that does is it takes away the infrastructure and capacity that does assessment. We've studied the amount of time and effort we spend checking versus doing, and checking outweighs doing 2 to 1. You don't get checking and eligibility infrastructure for free. It costs money. And we'd rather unlock that capacity and turn it into how might we help you, who can help you, what matters to you, etc. So it sounds a bit sort of airy-fairy until you actually get into it. People with debt, people that are homeless, people that are struggling, people that aren't bad enough to require a social worker, but whose lives are off track, and we need to help them find a way onto track. So bespoke by default is the key maxim around our different way of approaching public services and just services in general.
Awesome. Thanks for kicking us off there, Mark. Doesn't sound too radical, does it? We've just got rid of eligibility criteria. We've only got 2 rules. I think you've just rewritten Whitehall as 2 rules pretty much there.
That'll do, yeah.
So I'm going to try and stay out of the way of this fishbowl, but maybe I'll invite Annie to come in, because we said this would be a warts and all account. And I think there's things that Mark's intimated there in terms of some of the headwinds that you have to deal with. I know you've got some direct experience of that as well, Annie. Would you mind sharing some of that?
Sure. So as a midwife of many years, my sort of passion, I suppose, is around continuity of care, because what women really want is to know the midwife or a small group of midwives who are giving them their care. And it's really, over many, many years now, there's been a real sort of problem with fragmentation of the services, of maternity services. And recently, I think 2015, there was a national maternity review to look at the sort of issues within maternity. And the big thing that came out is continuity of care. And it should be provided for most women. And another part of the review talked about increasing the number of providers who were able to give that sort of care. And that's where neighbourhood midwives came in. So we were a small midwifery enterprise, social enterprise. We started in 2012 with the primary sort of goal of offering women their own midwife, a midwife they could get to know and trust was our sort of byline. But equally important for us was that we wanted to do it in a way that really worked for midwives, because one of the big difficulties is that when you, in the small areas within the very large bureaucratic NHS, where you have teams of midwives providing continuity of care, they get lost in the system and they often get burnt out because they're trying to work and provide that care within the system. So we took a very different approach. The maternity transformation program that started as a result of the review really wanted to, I mean, they talk about radical models. We need radically different new models of care that really work for women and for midwives. And so we went, hello, we're here, we want to do that. That's exactly what we can provide. And we were successful in getting a pilot in Northeast London. We started with one small team. We were very clear from the beginning that it had to be more than 1 or 2 teams to be sustainable. We had we modeled a sort of a journey that we needed to go on. And we really thought that with Fair Winds and the maternity transformation program, we were going to be successful. And we were in many ways. So the pilot ran for 2 years, from 2016 until we closed in 2019. And with hindsight, of course, which is a very wonderful thing, We were sort of busy providing care. We were growing our second team. We were getting brilliant results, great outcomes. Our midwives were flourishing. Everything was working, except for the bit where we came up against the system. In order to even get the pilot underway, there were all sorts of rules, if you like, that needed to be bent, because when you're a small independent provider offering NHS services, there's all sorts of different rules. There's a lot of similar rules, one of which is that we still had to have the same very large and unwieldy contract, something like 90 pages. We needed to provide all the screening. We needed to sort of look like the rest of the system, but we weren't like the rest of the system. And as time went on, it became increasingly clear that the bit that didn't fit was how we would be commissioned, going beyond the pilot, and how we would be funded long term. And there was all sorts of ideas and reform sort of plans and working groups and all sorts of ideas about, well, that's all right, that'll get sorted. And we were really sort of rolling down the hill towards the end of the pilot, and none of those things were sorted. And the reality, of course, is you can't, when you're a small organization, you have very few resources. And so I was increasingly sort of shouting from the drowning boat, saying, you know, we need to know about commissioning, we need to know how the funding is going to work. And we ran out of time and space in order to get those things, because those are enormous barriers and they can't be changed, not in 2 years, not in 3 years. I think it's the system-wide change that's needed just wasn't there for us. And it's heartbreaking in many ways, because we were a case study in the 10-year plan, in the long-term plan for the NHS, as a successful team providing exactly what the maternity transformation programme wanted. Our midwives loved it, and we're still all in touch now. And sort of, you know, together we're sort of trying to wave the flag for what we did. But my sort of conclusion, I think, is that if you're going to try and bring in radically different models, that lack of fit with the system is the big barrier that we have to climb over. And that's why I'm part of Next Stage Radicals, because actually what the group of us look at are things like, okay, how do you do commissioning radically differently? How do you do the funding in a different way? How do you do regulation in a different way? Which are all, they all work still, but they'll work better, and they will enable organisations like mine, or indeed teams of midwives within the NHS, to function better and provide the care that midwives want to provide and that women really want and need to have.
Thank you, Annie. I mean, it's an awesome story, and it's heartbreaking to hear how well it went and yet didn't succeed. I think a classic case of can't evaluate the new system by the measures of the old. I saw Jeremy nodding vigorously as you were talking. So I wonder, Jeremy, given that you had a role as Director of Quality in CQC, maybe you could talk to us a bit about what have you seen through your efforts to affect change that kind of tell us a bit about what we need to give up in order to embrace a new system, or indeed what we need to put in its place?
Yeah, I was nodding vigorously, because I think I've made a note of some questions to come back to later around, in the fishbowl, what funding models have we seen, or tricks that we've managed to pull off that will help maybe give people a bit of hope around how to learn from that hindsight. But I'm an engineer by trade originally, and frankly, you know, what made me a radical was doing an MBA and discovering how unscientific and flaky most management method is. You know, basically you can get away with anything, I think, if you make it look pretty and sound plausible. And I think we are in a real position where we don't challenge critically the things that we put in place to manage our organisation. So to make that concrete and relevant to Annie's story, I had 18 months with CQC, the Health and Social Care Regulator in England, helping them establish their internal quality improvement program. And that was really motivated by a desire, to help an influential organisation work better, but also all that I'd seen in clients I'd worked with over the years in the public sector around the dysfunction that regulation can cause. And frankly, the unequal power dynamics are a real issue, and there's lots of psychological research to show us why this happens, but generates pathological behaviour in organisations. And I think it was really interesting to observe, having now been both sides of that, within the regulator, lots of really decent, well motivated, smart people, but as an organisation, really finding it very, very difficult to see its way past inspection as being the method of regulation. And I think that if you apply that to Annie's experience, and while I was there, I was helping a home care organisation that was radically different, using self-management methods, get set up. It was really obvious that the regulators just can't absorb the weirdness of radical organisations. So just as with Annie, they may be doing fantastic work, they may have real breakthroughs and insights in terms of the services that they're providing and the outcomes that they're creating for their staff as well. But because they don't fit into that lens or the letterbox that Mark described, the regulator just can't make sense of them. And it becomes quite a traumatic experience for that organisation, and especially if it's a startup, it might not be particularly well resourced. It's really hard for those organisations to make their way through those processes. Now, the home care organisation we were involved with, ended up on their first inspection being rated as outstanding, which was a recognition that they were actually doing something quite radical and interesting and effective. But
interject there, we were also inspected in April, so 4 months after we started our pilot.
Yeah.
And it was a very traumatic experience, but we came out of it really well. I mean, it took a long time to get them to understand what it was we were doing, because as a self-managing teams, that's how we worked. But to be fair, they did really try and and get it. I mean, they said that we'll come to your office, and we said we don't have an office. Can we have all your files? We don't have files. We're all virtual. But they kept going with it, and we did have a really positive report at the end of it, which demonstrated for us that actually, they can get it, and it is possible to look at these organisations and say, yeah, they're doing great work, because they talked to the women and they talked to the midwives who all said, this is great.
Yeah, and I think the learning is that, as with the home care organisation, you have to gather your friends around you and help the regulator. So it could be the regulators, it could be the funders, it could be any number of different external organisations that are involved with you. You've got to gather your friends around you and make really deliberate efforts to engage in that outside system. So I'm sure everyone else on this call will have loads to say around their experiences of that.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I'm going to invite Andy to jump in, because I think gathering your friends around you feels very much like what I'm seeing Andy do up in the northeast. Andy, jump in and tell us whatever you think would be of interest around the system stewardship stuff, because there's so much there.
Yeah, there are two very different stories that I want to tell. So I'm going to indulge myself and tell them both, but I'm going to try and keep them brief. So we're doing a bit of work at the moment, and it's interview based. So we're conducting interviews across the system. So in the course of these interviews, we're talking to people who are part of multi-agency meetings who meet to discuss people with multiple and complex needs. And it's good that these meetings exist. And the people talk about in the meetings, they talk about them as a really good space where they build relationships with people in other agencies and other parts of the system. It's really good to be able to learn about what each other does, to build those support networks. So if you need help, you know who to go to. And people generally are really positive to be part of this multi-agency meeting. The problem is that there are about 15 of these multi-agency meetings across Gateshead, and Gateshead is a small locality, and they talk about the same people. They often duplicate what the other meetings are doing. In the worst cases, they contradict what the other meetings are doing. So meeting A will say we should do this, meeting B will say we should do the exact opposite. The meetings don't talk to each other. Now, I tell this story, A, because it's really current and I've spent about 4 hours with my head in it today, so it's really front of mind. But also, when we're talking about systems, it's really important to recognize, I think, and a couple of people have mentioned this, just how fragmented systems are. It's very easy to think of the system as a unified block that, you know, that has it all together, but it's not. People see their tiny part of the system and tend to not think more widely and not step outside their particular frame of reference. And that in itself causes all kinds of difficulties. So that piece of work that we're involved in, basically our remit there is to sort that mess out. So if anybody's got any ideas for how to sort that mess out, please let me know. We're right at the beginning of this piece of work, but it's quickly emerging as massive and terrifying.
That's cheating. I'd set you up to have all the answers, Andy.
Damn it. And here are all the answers that I've got prepared. But in terms of what Andy indicated about pulling friends together, totally aside from that other piece of work, I said at the start, so our work is very much in terms of system stewardship. Now, I hope a few people are familiar with the notion of system stewardship. For anybody who's not, it's at its broadest, it's about just trying to make systems healthier through connecting people. A lot of what I do is introducing people, trying to create opportunities for different parts of the system to work together. But some of the stuff that I'm doing, which is most enjoyable, is about not just introducing people, but helping to deepen relationships. So I mentioned at the top of this, a few learning spaces that we've set up. I'm also part of the Human Learning System Collaborative. If people have come across Toby Lowe's work, I was actually being very gently interviewed today as part of the next report, which is going to be released after the new year. So we're talking about these spaces. We're talking about learning. And what we've done is we've created this spaces. When I talk about our space, it's a Zoom meeting, right? We've got a fortnightly Zoom meeting on a Wednesday morning. There's one tomorrow morning. And it's a 90-minute space where people can show up, and each week, each fortnight rather, we have a topic and people talk about the topic, right? From the outset, it doesn't look like there's anything particularly clever there. But this has been evolving into a really important space for a couple of reasons. So the first is people arrive in this space as people, as human beings. We don't do anything like, here's who I work for, here's what my job title is. I think a lot of people who know each other quite well through this space actually don't know what each other does as a job, which I find quite delightful. The second thing is the topics aren't pre-decided. Well, they are pre-decided. The topics are determined by the group. So like I said, we meet fortnightly, and at the end of each session, we go, right, what we're going to talk about next week. So we try to get somebody to give an introduction. So my dear friend Andy Brogan has been along to one of these. He gave us an introduction on red tape. We've talked about leadership. We've talked about doing the right thing. We've talked about inclusivity. We've talked about a whole bunch of stuff. What I probably found most interesting was when we had a session on vulnerability and integrity. So a few times people have said, you know what, can we just have an unstructured space where we just get to know each other a bit more? We've done that a few times and they've been really popular. But coming out of one of those unstructured relationship building spaces, people said, we want to talk about vulnerability and integrity. So what happened, we actually did that topic twice because it was so popular. What happened in the first one was actually just a quite incredible level of sharing. The sort of personal stories, you know, and Andy's mentioned warts and all, like people are talking about stories of the workplace that broke them. So, you know, they were on stress leave for 3 months. That level of story, and that level of sharing has only become possible because these sessions are every fortnight, because people are coming back in, because people are getting to know each other again and again in this safe and open space. And what's happening outside of this space is relationships are deepening. People are wanting to pick up side conversations. They're exploring new ways of working. They're exploring new possibilities. The space isn't there to do that, but it is one of the benefits that's shooting off from this. So I said I'd try and keep it brief, and I think I failed in that, but just to wrap this up, I think there are two really important things. One is allowing people to be people. And the other is creating space for people to learn without specifically trying to extract things from the learning. So they're my two, I don't know what, takeaways, bits of advice, whatever it is that we're delivering here.
Thank you, Andy. I can see Jeremy nodding vigorously again, I think because he and I share a sort of a background view of the world as sort of sciencey, engineering, mathematician-y, and this thing about people being people is like so alien, but something we've learned through hard experience is absolutely important. So with that in mind, when Saskia introduced herself, she used the words results through relationships, and it feels like I couldn't possibly not go to her next, given what you've said, Andy. So Saskia, let's hear a bit from you. So you can say whatever you want, but I'm kind of curious. I know you've done loads of work both locally and sort of regionally now, and even nationally, and I'm wondering what you're learning about what can make this easier or harder, or you know, tell us what you've learned.
Sure. So I mean, loads of stuff has resonated with what others have talked about already, and Andy's comment about, you know, having fortnightly meetings where people can just show up. You know, we've used that kind of model in the work that we're doing within the Southwest region in England, which started back in April as a kind of, we all need to get together to talk about COVID and what we're doing about COVID. We were meeting every week, but actually pretty quickly it just became a useful space to meet and to show up, and you know, like you've been doing, kind of having themed sessions every fortnight that the group decides what we talk about. We might invite someone in from outside of the group to kind of start us off, but yeah, just having a really open space to talk and building those relationships, so that has, I think that's strengthened the work in the Southwest enormously, and been a real support for people doing, you know, I think we've all been finding it a challenging time, haven't we, over these last, there might have been some positives to the last 6 months, but it's been hard as well. So having spaces like that has been fantastic. And over the last couple of years, we've been doing some work in Dorset around results to relationships. So part of that has been kind of, I mean, it resonates a lot with what Mark talked about at the start, about finding out what matters to people, what's going on in their lives, and trying to kind of help support them through that or focus on that together. So we started off in an end of life, kind of last months of life sort of space, rather than in a council tax kind of space, but actually it's very similar themes that have, you know, come up for that really resonate throughout. So the way we kind of looked at it in Dorset was around developing a sort of shared sense of understanding about what really mattered towards the end of life, and just a few key things, you know, half a dozen, I think it was 6 initially, and then we kind of, reviewing it with stakeholders, it turned into 7 statements about kind of what really mattered in the last year or so of life, and using that as a way to help us kind of keep grounded during the actual day-to-day work, but also as a way to reflect together about whether or not those things have been achieved. And I think some of the things that I've learned about that is that it's very much not just about the technical, the engineering side of, you know, what matters and how can we define that and operationalize it, whatever, but actually the social side of it, working, you know, one of the key things that we found with working with people towards the end of life and their families, it's a lot about the conversations that we have with people, much more than it is about medication or interventions or anything like that. A lot of it is around the conversations that we have. But for me, one of the biggest changes was more about conversations I was having with colleagues than it was about the conversations I was having with people reaching the end of their life. So yes, there's definitely been a change in my day-to-day work, but the biggest change has been in how I relate to colleagues, both within the organisation and outside the organisation. So yeah, but it's still definitely a kind of a work in progress, and you know, I'm not getting it right all the time by any means, but at least I'm more aware now of when it's going well and when there are things that need to work on.
Thanks.
It's not for now necessarily, Saskia, but it'd be interesting to reflect on the extent to which your professional training prepared you for that, you know, switching.
Yeah, probably not at all, Jeremy, I'd say. I mean, in the sense that, you know, I've been a doctor 20 odd years, and so much of it being a doctor, you know, we talked about having the answers, you know, a lot of it you kind of feel like you ought to know what to do, you ought to know what the answer is, you know, and that's quite a hard thing, maybe, just to say, actually, you know what, I don't need to always know the answers. It's more important that I'm there to help support people to understand what matters, and, you know, perhaps there might be something we need to find out together, or perhaps I do, you know, have some other stuff to find out, but being right about or knowing the answer isn't the most important thing at all. And the other thing that kind of struck me when we were talking about regulators and CQC is that I think having I haven't worked for an organisation with an outstanding report, and in some ways I would love to do that, but I think one of the other learning points for me has been it's more important about kind of how we all work together as the whole system across you know, the whole health and care community, or the whole community, rather than it being about an individual organisation getting an outstanding report. To me, what matters is kind of what's it like for the next person who's kind of nearing the end of their life in, you know, here. What's the experience going to be like for them and their family, and also for the staff supporting them. But that matters loads more than have we got a tick in the right box in a CQC report. And sometimes we need to give up a bit of that professional pride and organisational pride in order to be able to move forward with kind of developing really good relationships with the people from different organisations across the whole patch. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, but I think for me it feels like it needs to, the initial focus needs to be on that rather than on in the outstanding.
Yeah. Just one of the things I wanted to mention while it seems in the flow is that the learning spaces that Andy and Saskia and others have talked about, that there are equally important pragmatic and therapeutic qualities to them, and they're both extremely important. The pragmatic one is simply that if you are taking somebody, like I say, a social worker, whose training probably does prepare them for those conversations, but the system doesn't let them have them. So, and then you're letting them have them again, or you're saying, no, go do that. That's quite unsettling. And also because they've been working to a standardized assessment framework or whatever, and you're all of a sudden saying, actually, do you know what? The bespoke by default, go understand that person, and in trying to work with them and those that are dear to them to figure out what they're bespoke, we've had dog grooming, we've had all sorts of weird and wonderful things that have been part of the solution. The network's not there because they've not been encouraged to build it. So this is where people like Andy actually help us to put the nuts and bolts on how to build a network. So this therapeutic sort of learning together thing around, it's unsettling. You probably feel very exposed because you don't have that assessment framework in front of you, but we've got you back. And actually, pragmatically, here's a bunch of people that you might not have come across before that may well be able to help you because you've sought to understand context, and all of a sudden you're asking a bunch of different, better questions about how we can pragmatically try stuff out with somebody and see if it works. So those learning spaces and that learning way and that building capacity has to be both therapeutic and pragmatic. And if it's just one, it's a networking exercise, then we know how tiring they are and tiresome they are. And if it's just the other, it's not unhelpful, but it probably won't be enough to change the actual fabric of how the work actually works. So I'm trying to work with Andy and others, with Andy Crosby and others, to to encourage people to use those environments, and actually have enough humility to go in there and say, I'm actually quite vulnerable, I'm struggling, help me understand a wider world out there, and actually I've got a bunch of pressures internally and I need to help with them. And I think that's something that we're getting better at, but it's a long road, because people are still quite paranoid about somehow not complying and being hauled out. It's particularly in dwindling resources and lots of pressure, it's difficult. But those two aspects, a therapeutic and a pragmatic, in those, some people criticise them as quite woolly spaces. I think they're extremely important. So I would echo a lot of what I'm hearing.
I think that's one of the most important things I've learned, is that it's not social or technical. It's a collision and a synthesis of the two. And you have to be social and technical at the same time, and then figure out ways of doing that are appropriate to each particular context. So just as the way we deal with citizens is bespoke by design, the way we have to deal with each organizational problem or bunch of relationships that we hit, that has to be bespoke as well. But it's still anchored in some good theory and some good methods. Yeah. But we've got to be thinking technical and social simultaneously.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm almost loath to cut across, because you're now doing what I'd hoped you'd do, and you're all leading the conversation, but I want to make sure that Anna has a chance to share her reflections too. Anna has a really good habit of waiting to the end of things and then coming in with something stellar, like she did with the blog on Next Stage Radicals. We'd all written our blogs, and then 3 months in, Anna writes one and it absolutely sets the place on fire. So no pressure, Anna, you just need to come up with some words of wisdom now.
Oh dear, thanks Andy. Really enjoying the discussion, everyone. Thanks for your contributions. I wanted to pick up on a few specific points people had made which really resonated with me. And DC, when you were talking about these multi-agency meetings, it was really ringing true for me. I feel like I've sat in quite a few of very, very similar sort of settings. And actually, so last week, I spent the week working with a bunch of different council enforcements, of which we have more than I can count, maybe 20 or so different enforcement services. And we were doing a sort of a week-long scoping. And as part of this, I was able to sort of dip in and just shadow, virtually shadowing, this is a new experience as well, but virtually shadowing what happens in one of these, they call them the hub partnership meetings. And so it was fascinating. I sort of went in but actually it wasn't surprising really that, I suppose what I was witnessing was a bunch of really capable professionals from different services having a conversation about some cases that they were really stuck on, having a sort of brain dump as to what they could possibly do about it without real framework. And it was all pretty tweaky stuff, to be honest. I mean, it was, just to try and bring that to life. So, there was this one man who'd been released from prison onto the estate in Camden, and he'd started congregating with lots of other men in a children's play area in the middle of the estate, and they'd started trying to groom local school kids to deal drugs. And I mean, there was just an awful, as you can imagine, there were lots and lots of issues. And I suppose what I was thinking as I was witnessing this well-meaning discussion, what I was thinking was, I wonder whether there's anybody in the system, like the wider system, who actually has a positive relationship with any of these individuals, or anyone who's understood anything about what matters to them or about their lives. The conversation I was witnessing was coming up with things like, let's put up a sign next to the school playground, just so that when we go to tell them they have to move on, we can point to it, and then we can go, look, it says it's a school playground, children's playground, therefore you've got to move on. And I just thought that sort of embodies one of the problems we've got really in our public services, which is, despite, these individual colleagues from different services, they've got brilliant relationships with each other. That's the only way the current system survives. It's people really getting on with each other, sharing information, even though they're not allowed to by the system, because they know that makes sense, including with the police as well, who are in the meeting. And so, I totally agree with what everyone's been saying about the importance of relationships. But I guess what I witnessed in that hub meeting was, within the current paradigm, it was a brilliant meeting. Like, you know, we have partners working together, but actually it's just not, it's not gonna cut the mustard in terms of getting anywhere near the proactive work that we all know we need. You know, it's totally reactive and doesn't get into any of it. So I suppose what that prompts me to, I suppose, come back to, you know, coming back to Andy B's original question of what's my vision for next stage public services. I suppose, and there's very much building on what Mark was saying, you know, I think, you know, I would really like to say, and yes, I am an optimist, but I believe that we can have a world in which people feel properly listened to and understood by public services and don't fall through those cracks. You know, we know from all of our learning that it will need services to be local and relational by default rather than transactional, fragmented and siloed. And in order to achieve it, it will require a fundamentally different approach. And listening to what Margaret Wheatley was saying last night, I don't know whether anyone else was there. Sorry, I know some of you were, but yeah, it was quite stark, really, just how powerful the barriers are to achieving this. And it may well take a while to do, and we probably do need to create islands. And you know, and Annie's story really resonated with me as well just now about the power of the wider system. And I'm totally babbling on for too long here, but yeah, I feel like within my organisation we've now got a few of these islands as well, and I suppose I have to accept it's not really within my control or to some extent influence whether or not we can sustain some of these islands, and that's pretty tough because the wisdom is already kind of drawing in on those islands. But I suppose it is part of my role to try and help particularly the leaders of the organisation to really see that that's happening and make a more conscious decision about whether that's what they want to do. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Anna. I was not disappointed. I knew you'd sweep in with something awesome at the end. So, folks, we're going to draw this element of our session to a close. So just to share a couple of quick thoughts before I invite you to go into breakout rooms and gather your own thoughts. I think first one, just building on what Anna was saying there, you know, progress is never linear, and we're creating these islands of sanity, and sometimes they're becoming larger land masses and sometimes they're being eroded and so on. But I, for one, remain relentlessly hopeful that if we take a broader, sort of longer term perspective, things are coalescing and going in a useful direction. That's my belief. And I think listening to you all speak this evening, my belief, and I think you've reflected this, is that direction is to be kind of bespoke by default, to be relational by default, to be local by default, to be human and humane by default, to be strengths-based, asset-based, community-orientated by default, all of these sorts of things. And it's not that those don't exist in some ways in the current paradigm, but I think it's that they aren't by default, and that's the big thing.
Yeah.
So we noted in our sort of pre-match waffle that, you know, there's the jaws of doom, the rising demand, the shrinking budgets, etc. What each of those that have spoken tonight didn't go into in great depth is actually the success that their islands of sanity have seen in terms of doing things that are both more effective and more efficient. Cost savings and better outcomes at the same time. So there are case studies of those sorts of things on nextstageradicals.net and in other places if you want to find out more. But for now, I'd like to invite you to go into breakout rooms. And I'm just very briefly going to share a link with you in the chat, everybody. So this link is to a Jamboard. You don't need to sign in, but if you click into it, you'll find that there is a place with 4 slides, if you like, that you can click through that provide 4 separate points for discussion. And I'm inviting you in your breakout rooms to discuss these things and capture your responses. So the prompts are: what's resonated for you? What are you seeing that's different? What else are you seeing? And also, what would you intend to do in leaving this session? What's your kind of action statement, the thing that you think you could leave and go and start to do or continue doing that could bring about this next stage of public services? So hopefully you've all got that link now. I'm going to put you into breakout rooms. I'll bring you back automatically in about 25 minutes just for a quick pull together and to share your thoughts. Okay, folks, so I'm going to open the rooms now. Go and have fun. So I hope you all had a great discussion. I've been browsing your post-its and so on in the Jamboard. There's some interesting stuff in there for sure. I also spotted, I think, a really apposite comment in the chat before you left. Louise left us the comment about, you know, the system doesn't allow the system to change. If we're not careful, we're down the rabbit hole. Really think that's such an important comment, and I want to add to what I closed out the last plenary with around, you know, bespoke by default, relational by default, etc. I also think we need to think agency, not agencies by default. We get so lost in the system and the institutions, but we all have whatever power we choose to take, at least to some extent. So with that in mind, the one bit of the Jamboards that is sparsely populated at the minute is that I intend to, which is the agency bit. It's the what are we going to do when we leave here. So I'd just like to give you just a couple of minutes while we're together before we start to share and discuss the Jamboards, just to jump back into that link. I'll post it once again for you. But jump in and just capture anything you can on any of them, but particularly your I intend to comments. If you can't get Jamboard to work for you, feel free to paste them in the chat and I'll add them to the Jamboard for you. And just in case anybody's struggling to find where I mean, along the top of your screen, you should be able to see a kind of left and right arrow and numbers 1 to 6. So you want to be on board 4 of 6, which has a sticky in the top corner saying I intend to. Awesome. So I can see people are still in there adding things, so don't let me stop you. But what I thought I'd also do is invite anyone that would like to either come off mute and shout out and share anything that feels like it's burning for you, or stick your hand up and wave at me and I'll try and pick you out of the crowd, or use the hands up function in the chat, or however you want to grab my attention or the attention of others. Would anyone like to share anything before we finish up? There we go, Louise. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I'll go. I've always been fascinated about how people show up at work. So what happens to people when they walk through the door at work? Because I'm pretty sure, you know, if you've got an organization which is quite sort of command and control or bureaucratic, etc., it's almost like we adopt a persona of the organization when we walk through that door. And I'm pretty sure lots of people aren't like that in their personal lives. So it's almost like that accountability, responsibility all gets left at the door, and then they come in and they're passive beings. So actually, what's the role of leadership? What's the role of OD in terms of changing? It's changing the right word. It's working with people to present a different way of being in an organization, because I'm an optimist in terms of humanity. I'm pretty sure not many people wake up in the morning and decide to go to work and be a complete pain in the bum and be really bureaucratic and command and control, and etc. So actually, how do we create the conditions to allow people to be their true selves and therefore allow a different way of working, both internally and externally, and get rid of that myth that organizations have to be run like this? So I think that's my view.
Thank you, Louise. I can see almost every head on the screen nodding in agreement to that. You asked that as a question, but I'm curious, do you have thoughts? I mean, what is the role of OD? What can we do that enables that, Louise, or anyone, if that's putting Louise on the spot?
Well, I kind of posted it, so I kind of have to, I can't just post a question, I have to come up with some ideas to be responsible. I think lead by example. I'm a big fan of building a small but quite a passionate group of people who want to behave like that. So, you know, building that critical mass, and that can be from anywhere in the organisation. It doesn't have to be leadership. I quite like building the critical mass from the bottom up and the top down, and then you squeeze the middle. And actually, employees can be more powerful than leaders sometimes in this situation. And just I just keep banging on about what people will say are crazy ideas, and just bringing in lots and lots of different examples. You know, self-managed teams was a crazy idea even 2 years ago, but it's not anymore, is it, really? So just, you know, you need tenacity, but you also need to look after yourself outside work, because it's a hard job.
Thank you for that. It really resonates for me. One of the things I talk about a lot when I'm at work is kind of leading for fellowship. The idea of how do we just kind of create little groups, little networks that look after each other and look after the work. And for what it's worth, I'm so with you that building it bottom up, top down, middle out, it sort of doesn't matter. But what a great opportunity to demonstrate what agency can achieve by building it bottom up. I think that's a great way to role model the difference. So, anyone else want to jump in with thoughts, questions, anything?
Yeah, I think just to respond to Louise, I think there's a real spectrum of how you can conduct yourself in response to your provocation. And for some people, you know, they have limited powers, they might have limited resources and networks. And for some of those, you know, just doing things within the environment of their team and the space they can influence actually is pretty radical. For me, I remember the days, years ago when I had a proper job, when I used to just flat out refuse to participate in the performance appraisal system. So I would just sit there with my manager and say, well, you can basically say what you like for the next hour. I'm not joining in because this whole thing is just pointless. And, you know, that's not for everybody. And I was a callow, idiotic, you know, youth at that point and thought, you know, why not? So I think, you know, and then there's other people who just gently influence things in the background. So as Andy said, let's just nurture our relationships with each other, look after each other, you know, don't be reckless and brave all of the time. Have little outbreaks of stupidity and bravery, but then give yourself a break and, you know, take your foot off the gas at other times. Just build and build, one problem at a time, one person at a time, one relationship at a time. And as Andy said, look after yourself.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm feeling the shame of, you said you were a callow idiotic youth. I'm a callow idiotic middle-aged man, so it seems you've improved.
Yeah, the only thing that's different is I'm now older.
Alex, I saw you waving at me there. Alex Poppleton? No, you were just agreeing that I'm a callous idiotic middle-aged man.
I'm constantly still doing those things.
I was just going to say, when Neighbourhood Midwives finished, we had a big meeting. Everybody came, obviously, and we had a few rituals. And one of the things that we did is we had some writing stones, and everybody wrote a little message on the stone. And they were very. I've got some upstairs. And then, but there were things about, you know, what a great sisterhood and Neighbourhood Midwives forever, and, you know, just very positive messages. And I really wanted the idea of, you know, the ripples from the stones that are thrown in the pond or the river or the sea, whatever, that those ripples continue. So every one of these conversations, every failed or closed down attempt creates a momentum, and something that will ripple out in ways that we have no idea, actually. But I am, you know, the ultimate optimist that it will, whether it's in the next cycle in Margaret Wheatley's world or in this cycle still, because it's the right way to be. And I think everybody who's talked about, you know, human, person-centered, woman-centered, local, all of those things, it's so logical that has to be the way that we end up. That's the place we have to end up.
I really like that, Annie. Thank you. And I'm wishing that Jose Leal was still with us. I know he's had to go, but he would talk about how whatever happens at any stage in our history, as individuals, as communities, as a whole species, it layers. You know, we never really unlearn or completely lose the past. It just kind of submerges. And I think what we're doing now is building those layers. It's helping to create the future in those small ways that will at some point add up to more than an island of sanity. So I strongly believe that. I hope you do too. I'm conscious of time. I'm actually a minute over, so I'm going to try and be a good host and not keep you here. Just a final couple of things. I noticed one of you during the breakout rooms actually went and signed up for our next Stage Radicals Facebook group. I'm going to put links in the chat for those of you who would like to come and join in with us. So we do a couple of things. We keep a website where we all blog and podcast and stuff. We'd love for any of you to turn up there either as a consumer or as a contributor, and you'll find out more on the site. And in our Facebook group, we just turn up to try and keep each other sane. So again, please feel free to turn up there, and hopefully we can keep you sane and you can help us too. But it's been a pleasure getting time with you this evening, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll share the videos and the chat and some of the Jamboard stuff through the Hoover app for those that want to follow up. And I hope to bump into you in another call somewhere in the carnival. Thank you.
Nice to see you all.
Yeah,
Thank you. Good night. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.